you for coming. So when Jakob first asked me to do this, he asked me what subject I'd like to speak on, and I chose, an absurdly ambitious one, why books sell. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, I don't really know. I was really sure. And the whole point is nobody knows. I used to work in publishing, and that's the whole absurdity of it, is nobody really knows. It's all triangulation. You just have to triangulate, the cover, the author, the subject, and just sort of hope that it hits, it hits a sweet spot. So I thought an interesting way to go about talking about this would be to ask, this is my ex-husband, Chris Jackson, whose name is also in the bookstore, and he works in publishing. He's an executive editor at Spiegel and Grau, which is part of Random House. This is Matt Picnic. I always pronounce your name wobbly.
That was good.
Okay. Matt Picnic. It just seems too easy. Okay. This is Matt Picnic, who works in the bookstore, and he does some of the buying for the store in the theater, plays, and European literature section. And so we thought the format, we brought a whole bunch of books that have succeeded or haven't succeeded, because, when you start thinking about why books sell, you realize that a book does not equal a book. This book does not equal this book. People obviously buy these books for completely different reasons, which is why book selling is so interesting. It's like you're running many, many stores within a store, and you need books to appeal to different people for completely different reasons. So, so we thought we'd sort of go through kind of subject by subject, and we have examples, and we can. There's more people than I expected, frankly, to be here, because I thought we could have more of an open debate forum, but we can go through. Because another thing about my particular store is it's obviously very specific. It's the largest independent bookstore in Manhattan. It's in downtown Manhattan. It's not in uptown Manhattan. It's fed by an international community of customers. It's fed by many, many universities. It's fed by a very educated customer who is more globally focused than a lot of customers at a lot of bookstores. So a lot of books that for us are wild successes would not qualify as a wild success in the publishing world. When we started talking about this, I kept bringing up Knausgaard, which for everyone who comes to the Pen Festival, that would be a big deal. And we have an event at the store coming up where we've got Knausgaard with Zadie Smith and James Wood, and for us that's like basically hosting President Obama or something. It's such a huge deal. But I kept talking about Knausgaard as a success story, and Chris, as a publisher, was like, Sarah, not really, it will probably relatively speaking. And so there is sort of this skewed angle that I'm coming from. And also, I think in my store, the aesthetic sort of umbrella of the store is so powerful that there's some things like it's interesting. So we brought Lenin, which was obviously a huge success, although not a great book by any stretch, writing-wise, but a huge success and a great idea. And it was amazing that we could make this cover work in our store. And the Elizabeth Warren book looks ridiculous in my store, and it's the same cover, woman grinning on the cover, the white with text underneath, but there's very subtle gradations that are actually visual that make things work in my store versus somewhere else. I was in Harvard Bookstore 2 days ago, and the Elizabeth Warren book looked great there. And I don't know if it was because she was a Harvard professor, so it had some deep meaning. And so it's interesting when you're in a bookstore and you're looking at a book, you're making visual decisions, but they're anchored in intellectual decisions. So I think the Elizabeth Warren book looks stupid in my store because I have no connection. It just doesn't make sense. But because subtly I connect her with Harvard, it makes sense in the Harvard bookstore. And although it felt like a visual decision in my store, it clearly wasn't, if that makes sense. So, I don't know, there's so many different subjects. So we thought, do people feel comfortable with sort of an open debate sort of format? All right, where should we start?
Do you want to start with something that's like
Let's start with
big
the
and
Goldfinch.
recognizable? I have a feeling people have heard of this book.
Yeah, and so the Goldfinch, an interesting phenomenon. A lot of us have read it at the bookstore, and no one would deny that it is a good book.
I think it won a prize. Just recently.
Exactly. But there's nothing that we can see that makes it better than a lot of other books that are published in a year. There's a lot of very good books published in a year. So it's interesting why does this book rise to the top of a crowded field? Because what?
The author reputation.
The author reputation.
Her previous book.
Not her previous book, but her previous book. Because her last book didn't really rise to the top. She had a book in between that was okay.
The Little Friend.
Yeah.
Anticipation, just because it took so long, so
Mhm.
people were sort of intrigued by what it might be.
Mm-hmm.
So it coincided with the show, Goldfinch.
At the Goldfinch show, that makes sense in New York. Yeah. Although I think there's an interesting point to that. I think there's something in fiction that people really respond when it's anchored in something with established intellectual credibility. And this has, because of that show, I think this had that anchor in established intellectual credibility. In the same way that, what was that hedgehog book that Europa put out?
The Elegance of the Hedgehog.
The Elegance of the Hedgehog. Right, and that was the same thing. It was these books that you can kind of feel like you're getting sort of an education for free without any expense. I mean, any difficulty. You're getting free education, a little bit of one. In a book, I think it had that.
I think that's something else that Donna Tartt's books generally
Right.
have, is the sense that you're reading fiction, but you're also kind of immersing yourself in some kind of educational experience. I mean, that was sort of the magic of the secret history, where you could read it and think you were a classicist. You know, I mean, it was kind of a much easier way of becoming a classicist than studying for many years, and it was very compelling. And the other thing about her writing is that and I think this is another kind of key to like the kind of fiction that breaks out now, is it does have it's operating on two levels, so that it does have a kind of intellectual seriousness on one hand. On the other hand, it has there's still kind of a potboiler aspect to her writing, so that you in some ways, and I don't mean this in a bad way, it flatters the reader because it speaks to them in a language that has sophistication, but also provides the pleasures of storytelling and entertainment.
Well,
Yeah.
so the Secret History book rose to the top of the reading pile for a lot of people because it started to enter like this cultural conversation for readers of serious fiction,
Right.
and people from outside that circle started to come in. That's how I came to her work. So
Right.
there was like this conversation going on about that book.
And that's something that any novel, actually any book you're going to see rise to the top, gains that status. And it's a bit of a crapshoot which ones do. And I think that we as an industry are getting worse and worse at giving books this status. You know, I was on, I'm sure I can talk about this. I didn't sign any non-disclosure. I was on, don't sign,
That's
you can
your
talk.
standard of confidentiality.
Yeah. I was one of the judges for the Story Prize, I think 2 years ago. And the Story Prize is the largest cash prize in America, and it was started for short story collections. And it was the year Junot Diaz for, what was Junot Diaz's last one? This Is How You Lose Her. For This Is How You Lose Her came out. And there were 3 books nominated, and Junot Diaz was one. And it was so obviously the best book nominated. It was, Junot Diaz, no matter what you might think about him, he clearly has a voice that will still resonate for decades and will continue to be read. And these other books, while they were beautiful and wonderful, they simply didn't have the force. You didn't feel when you were reading them that what was it? I can't believe I'm going to quote David Brooks because I don't like David Brooks at all, but his column this morning was kind of beautiful. I don't know if anyone else read it. I know, it's embarrassing to admit something with David Brooks, but he said something about, he was talking about Anna Akhmatova and Isaiah Berlin and their meeting and how it changed both of their lives and was the greatest night for both of them, and they fell in love, although it was not sexual. It was a union truly of mind and spirit. And he talked about how that love was based so much in what they had each read, and at the time that they lived, there were still people who were striving for that kind of artistic and intellectual fulfillment, and that education now doesn't set kids up for that at all. So they could talk about, Chekhov versus Dostoevsky for hours, where the education system is, people simply aren't reading that. What was my point? Where did I start this?
One was so much better than the other.
Oh, right, and he described these great authors as he says, and he said they've read so many great books by geniuses who understand us better than we understand ourselves. Yeah, which I thought was a beautiful way to put it. Okay, so here's Donna Tartt. So she rose to the top.
So how that relates to what you started saying?
What did I start saying?
Who loved you?
Oh,
About the
Juno
story of
Diaz,
Christ.
right, I knew there was
Yes.
something. So Juno Diaz, I mean, I think there are elements of that clearly in his work, which is, it's simply rare. It's rare always, and it's rare now, especially when there's so much competent fiction because it's so workshopped by the time it hits, you know, a binding, that there's a prevalence of competency and minimum of, you know, genius that makes you feel like someone understands you better than you understand yourself. And I said to, and I voted for Juno Diaz, obviously, and the other judges didn't. And I sent an email saying, what's going on here? I mean, it's obviously the best book. What's happening? And they said, you know, everyone already knows him. Everybody already knows Juno Diaz, you know, and it's like we hesitated to even nominate him. And I thought, interesting. I mean, what are Juno Diaz's sales, approximately?
I couldn't say.
But approximately, do you think?
I mean, in the hundreds of thousands. I don't think he's. I mean, I would say that the last one, the one that won the Pulitzer, Oscar Wilde, probably in paperback is approaching 1 million copies, maybe. It's between paperback and e.
Sorry, what?
He thinks.
This is pure speculation, but I would say that it's because it's
It's
published
just
by a
kind-
different
kind
company,
of-
or the same company now, but
Yeah.
anyway, at the time a different company. But I would say it's probably approaching like 1 million copies in all formats.
Yeah, and my point in bringing up the story was that as a community, we can be bad at just trying to hit upon the obvious thing. You know, we can, and sometimes we fail to get the energy around a single author. So it happens not that often.
Can I just ask a quick question? Because it was interesting to hear that you found out about the Goldfinch through.
No, she said secret history.
I'm sorry, Secret History.
Yeah, I
okay.
read the Secret
So
History.
how many people here have actually read or contemplated reading the Goldfinch? So you haven't actually. Wow.
You
contemplated.
Well, like, the reason I said contemplated is because I'm just curious about what made you want to do that, and if maybe some of you can
Word
talk
of
about that.
buzz around
The buzz?
it.
What specific buzz is that? Was it a friend? Was it just the media, or was it?
It was
Or a bunch of friends?
a more intimate circle
Mhm.
of people who raved about it and said that they really enjoyed it.
And were these people that you typically trusted to direct you toward fiction specifically, or are these people who just?
They're writers
Mhm.
whose work I
Okay.
admire.
Mm-hmm.
This author only writes like every decade.
Right.
So that alone is like the reason to just go, But I knew she was super smart, so.
Mm-hmm.
She is super smart.
I'd just like to bring up, I mean, nobody has mentioned marketing, the marketing campaign that is involved in a book like this. And I'm kind of curious, one reason I'm here is why I'm curious as to how publishers' marketing campaigns and those decisions affect what you buy and what you display in your store.
So you want to hear more from me than from the publisher on this question?
Yeah.
Okay. In my store, which again is a very specific store, I mean, there's, I didn't bring any book. I mean, there's huge slews of books that sell reliably in, Barnes & Noble and places that in my store would just look stupid, with these, often with photographs of women on the cover, like normally their bags, maybe they're holding an umbrella, their feet, That was like...
Unless it's Dear Life. You can put your feet on the cover. Dear Life will still
What
sell.
is with the Alice Munro packages recently?
We should have grabbed one.
It's so offensive. It's like they decided that no man would ever read her again, so they just... Anyhow. So for me, I block it out, but there are certain moments when I'm aware. So my philosophy, I think it would be safe to say our philosophy as a bookstore is that, and from the moment we opened it, I felt like there wasn't an independent bookstore in New York that was completely inclusive. So that when you come into my store, you can buy anything, any genre. There's a romance section, there's science fiction section, there's an excellent philosophy section. We are very deep into European literature. We're open to every customer. And so one of the customers we have to be open to is the customer who does respond primarily to the books that get to buzz books. And so I have to pay enough attention to marketing that I don't miss a buzz book. Mm-hmm. But because a publisher is behind something means, I think, very little to us personally as a store. It means very little to us because we do something. I have a firm belief that the more books that if I put books on our table, that are just good enough. The more I do that, and you pick up the book and it's like a good enough book and it says on the back, wow, this is really brilliant, the book of the year, and then you read it and it's just good enough. The more we do that, the more we lose credibility, and the more we lose readers, and the more we're doing the actual world of literature disservice, by getting behind books that aren't going to meaningfully impact somebody's life, mind, soul, heart. The more we do that, the more we just don't have a reason for existing. So I don't pay a lot of attention, and I know that the way decisions can happen in publishing, bad decisions can roll down to marketing. I mean, they can pay too much for a book up front, and you pay $1 million for a book, you're not going to abandon it in-house, even if the book doesn't turn out to be what you want, safe to say?
Yeah.
And so it doesn't necessarily mean something. And even, so I pay attention to a lot of things. There's the bookstores all around the country, and so there's buzz from other booksellers, and I know them. I mean, it's a very strong community. The independent bookstore community around the country is really very much present in my life and mind all the time. I see them a lot. I'm a member of two organizations that I go to meetings for, and I know these people. So if certain booksellers like a book, I think, okay, it means nothing to my store. But if I see it rising in other stores and blurbs from so that kind of marketing means a lot to me when I see booksellers I respect come through. Author blurbs, I care about them more. My reps tell me that I care more than most booksellers about blurbs, because I do. You can tell, but you can't obviously. Yeah, but you can't obviously trust them too much, because they're almost all personal favors, and so you have to read deeply into the book. How really enthusiastic is it? Like sometimes I give a job recommendation for someone who is meh to it, and I'm very polite, but I don't go the extra mile. So I use my kind of literary critical mind in reading blurbs.
Yeah, but again, it's like a triangulation of how many blurbs do they have,
right?
And how does that work?
Sometimes you get so many blurbs that it becomes like, it sort of discredits it. To me, it's like, come on, 20 blurbs? Like, clearly you're just sitting out. I mean, it's just people owe you favors. You earn those blurbs through a lifetime of probably asking.
So you're more cynical than me about blurbs.
Do you feel then that the choices that you make on a table, that it has an effect on why books sell?
Yeah, and we have, there have been a few stories of us actually making authors from our table. Not a lot, but a few. The most notable was Simon Van Boy, whose career it's funny, now doesn't sell that well in my store. But when do you know Simon Van Boy? Do anyone know? His first collection was published by Turtle Bay Press, and it was called, the title was so fabulous, I think it might be why it sold it. It was sort of a washed out picture you couldn't quite see, and it was called The Secret Lives of People in Love. And I just saw it when I saw it in the catalog, and it was in the consortium catalog, which is just a huge jumble of tiny little publishers who do everything from really wonky new age stuff to poetry to whatever. Something in it just spoke to me, The Secret Lives of People in Love. And it was a short story collection, and I ordered 12 in for the table, and they sold in one day. And we ordered more, and people in publishing bought it. My friend Paul Yamazaki, who's the buyer at City Lights in San Francisco, a publisher bought 4 copies off of my table and mailed them to him. Publishing and said, "You've got to read this and stock this book." And then and so I think it can make a difference, but I don't know if it typically does. And there are some books that we have sold so. I should have asked you, Chris, to look up. We brought this book by Thich Nhat Hanh, but there's a book by Thich Nhat Hanh called True Love, which we sold 2,000 copies of.
Something like that.
Wow. It's just a small book. It's unbelievable, and I don't know.
It's tiny, even its dimension. It's only 3/4 the size.
Yeah, and it's a lovely book. I read it. The first half. The second half is just kind of mindfulness 101, but the first half is it's a lovely book. We sold 1,000, and then this book. I don't know. Did you have the numbers for this?
I'm sorry.
No.
So this book, not Simone de Beauvoir's most notable book, maybe her 4th most notable book, 3rd or 4th, and they put this cover on it, and we put it on our table, and it has sold. What is it now? 1,500.
Yeah.
1,500 copies.
What period of time?
I think it's probably a year and a half, maybe a year.
It's
You know?
been a little bit over a year, maybe just about a year. I feel like
Yeah.
those repackagings came out last
Who's the
spring.
publisher?
This one is
It's vintage.
Beyond.
Oh, sorry.
What's the same?
It's,
So
does
why-
it have to do with the cover
This is
that
just
really
the
stood
cover.
out?
And so this is would you consider this marketing?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would too.
Because they've invested in
It's a good cover.
It's a good cover, and if we just ordered it for the shelf, we probably in that same period would have sold, I would say, 4 or 5.
Right, but it isn't your face now.
Since it's on the table. So yeah, I mean the table does make a difference, and it's
Because in fact, it reappeared at the same time as 2 or 3 other Simone de Beauvoir titles that are not hot pink, but
no cigarette.
but all have, and don't have toxic green lips, but do have beautiful, like monotone covers with watercolor images on the front, right? A memoir about Sartre after he died, and one about taking care of her mother as she was dying, right? Called A Very Easy Death. And neither of those took off like exactly the way that this did. I think part of it was
But you have
because
to factor in that that's a super graphic cover with those. I mean, I see that the covers are getting more graphic for certain kinds
For
of
certain books.
I don't mean like dirty graphic, but like arresting visually. Because I've looked at the book a number of times in your store.
Because of the cover.
Yeah, because of the cover, and I just go, oh right. And then it draws your eye down those colors. That's what
sure.
that
Well,
means to me.
and it's
That's- I
interesting. So
pick it up.
this trend, I think, started with urban young male fiction. Would that be safe to say? Benjamin Kunkel, this kind of graphic, clunky visual, started urban young male, and then that they burned through it because it became cliched, and you're seeing that style branch out. I mean, you're seeing that style branch out a little, and I think it works. I think it's working.
It did for me.
Yeah, I think it's working. And for a while, it was as soon as I saw that cover, I knew it was going to be an urban male, young novelist. It was just an immediate. It was an immediate thing that I have personally have to pay attention to. Those books in my store are relevant. So
It's also, it doesn't look like anything else that
That's
you
right.
see, right? And it's
That's
not just
right.
because it's hot pink. I mean, that's certainly part of it,
Graphically
right?
it works.
But
Yeah.
there are so many new books that come into the store, and I'm, often working on the floor and running around and shelving things. And even if I don't have a chance to read everything, I see everything. And so I see so many correspondences, and there are books that just get lost in the shuffle because their covers also are almost just like conform to a category
It's
of
a
cover.
template.
There are 4 or 5 books right now that have come out in the last half a year that are all on the shelf in American literature. They all have a deep blue image of a nighttime sky, and it sends a clear signal in a way, right? Like you pick this up and you have some sort of like sense for like excitement or drama or what's going on inside this book. But if you look at 5 different books that all have blue starred covers on them, it feels suddenly like you're like in a Hallmark store, and all those covers look exactly the same, and there's no reason to pick one up because you're
That happens
just
a lot in nonfiction
choosing
too.
one among many.
it certainly does happen in nonfiction, which in some categories is a cue. I mean, I worked briefly in history publishing, and it felt like every book we published sold 30 to 33,000 books, and they were books that. I mean, no one here would know them. They all looked the same. And those, because there was a certain kind of history reader that just wanted this familiarity, and this familiarity exists in a lot of different categories. I mean, you see it definitely in the thriller category or romance category. I mean, there's books that they all, mostly in genre fiction, there's books that all look the same, and people want that. I mean, we've talked a lot about that, about how we brought all these books here that people will buy because they want a unique experience. And I think most of the books that we sell are books that people want a unique experience. I mean, can I read the quote on the back of our bag that I love so much? Let me see. Oh, here they are. They're so fabulous. This is from, I don't remember which book I'm first. Okay, it says, "So it is that a well-read man, editor's note, or woman, will at once begin to yawn with boredom when one speaks to him of a new good book, because he imagines a sort of composite of all the good books that he has read, whereas a good book is something special, something unforeseeable, and is made up not of the sum of all previous masterpieces, but of something which the most thorough assimilation of every one of them would not enable him to discover, since it exists not in their sum, but beyond it." Right? Isn't that great? And so I think that all of these books, including What to Expect When You're Expecting, fall into that category. But then there are certain kind of readers that want that I mean, and moviegoer and television watcher and whatever who wants something a little more predictable. And it's, yeah, I don't know, in our store that doesn't work so well. I don't know if there's the night sky predictable genre that readers can get, because I've never read one of those books, frankly. But
Although I think it's interesting that like a book like this, for instance, works well in Sarah's store or the Simon Van Boyd in a way because the store itself, like when you're in an independent store, and particularly like a really beautiful independent store, you do enter kind of a romantic state of mind. And so something that feels like it's got some kind of romance, even if the romance is seems sort of tragic or angry or defeated or, you know, sort of romance of ruin.
Absolute annihilation.
These are all my preferred forms of romance. It becomes very appealing, and I think that there, you know, when you talk about people wanting some kind of predictable experience, I think when you go into a Barnes and Noble or you go into the Harvard bookstore and you see saying Elizabeth Warren, it kind of suits kind of what you've gone in there for. You know, if you go in Barnes and Noble, you see a lot of sort of shiny books, of celebrity books. If this book was there, it would. You'd have a completely different reaction to it. You'd think, oh, is this self-published? Is this like some kind of amateur thing happening here? Because everything else looks so kind of sparklingly professional.
Yeah, like look at these next to each other. It's absurd. It's completely absurd.
Beyond apples and oranges.
Yeah, the context is so powerful, you know, which is why running a bookstore is so strange, and why sometimes I feel like a bit of a tyrant in there, is because it's really such an instinctual, it's so deeply instinctual that sometimes you can't even verbalize it, but it is true. I mean, here's another book which does enormously well in our store. I send you a text, but enormously well in our store. And it's a staff favorite. And it's like
there's a cult of that. I have no idea.
And all my staff have stories of, you know, reading it on the subway, responses to it. And again, I mean, if you saw this in Barnes and Noble, I mean,
No, you wouldn't.
you just,
I know the buyer would never go for that. No.
It might be buried next to the bathroom.
Do you want to know what it's about? Or?
I mean, it's a bad love story, really, but it's semiotext, right? Which is you know, an academic press publisher that is deeply engaged with a lot of theory, right? And so it's really for like the academic set in a way. It's like my generation of, you know, students and young folks who are coming out of school or graduate programs and are deeply knowledgeable about theory, deeply knowledgeable about art history, deeply knowledgeable about all sorts of things that happen in the university, like starting in the 60s and post, right? In a weird way that like really resonates with a certain generation of folks right now, but it's sort of challenging writing in a way because it's not bound up with this like rollicking narrative with really awesome idiosyncratic characters and these sort of potboiler aspects. It's very interior. There's a lot of sort of like expounding on like love and philosophy and theory as you're reading it, and it's sort of the kind of hybrid mode of writing in a way. And so it seems about as far away from Donna Tartt as you might possibly get, and yet in our, you know, kind of anomalous or wonderful space, like it does really, really well. And I think part of that is, you know, like Chris and Sarah were both saying, like the sort of space that you're walking into. But also I think like those front tables that we have sort of have developed their own kind of culture around them, right? You have many folks are used to walking in and seeing interesting and or compelling things on the table. And that book has not infrequently been on the table.
Although it's old, it's from 1997.
Yeah.
And just with ordering for those front tables is such a challenge because I have to order for so many different kinds of readers. I've got to order for this reader and this reader in a way that will alienate neither. It's very subtle. So what were you going to say?
I was going to ask about the tables. So I know that, you know, in the larger bookstores, they are bought, the places on the table. So how do you navigate that?
Although they, I mean, there's a lot of talking about how they're bought, but it's the bookstore has a choice of which books they buy. It's not even Barnes and Noble. If they really didn't believe in a book, they wouldn't let the publishers buy that. I mean, we all have co-op dollars, and the way I do it is I do my buy, and then we apply the co-op retroactively to the things I bought. And it's a little more of a negotiation at Barnes and Noble, safe to say.
So you just you just sort of
I say these are the books I bought, and I put it on my table, and that's worth $25 to me, whatever it may be.
Right. There's also so many different tiers of what you can do at Barnes and Noble and how they can merchandise it. So because they have tables, they have end caps, they have different promotional things that all go. But
Well, they're fewer and fewer. When you walk in, you don't even see books there anymore.
it's hard to find.
Just wish
It
they
makes
could.
front table placement all the more important.
Yeah, hard to find the books, all this stuff. Yeah.
I thought I'd add a few things about the Goldfinch because I photographed Donna Tartt. That's my picture on the back of the book.
This is a great photograph.
That's great.
She's actually a back.
You turned her into a square, which I think is really amazing.
And it's so great too because it is so
Geometric.
rare to see a female author not smiling in a picture, and she looks friendly, but she has. I mean, as you look across, and it's the same. The men are all looking serious, and the women are all
Very
smiling. It's
very
frustrating. I thought this was such a nice balance.
Thank you. It's actually made in a parking lot on the Lower East Side.
Wow.
But there was a lot of very organized, very planned things that were done, of course, in advance of the book's publication. It was published 11 days to the date from the date of publication of Little Friend. Its worldwide debut took place in the Netherlands because it was in the Netherlands that her book had the most success. Her past books had the most success. The Secret History sold 800,000 copies. And when you think about the population of the Netherlands, it's quite mind-blowing that could happen. So when it published there, that picture was turned into bus billboards and subway billboards. The promotion was significant. It was the only country in which that was done. And the lines went on for blocks and blocks and blocks when she arrived to sign and promote the work. Her agent is one of the most powerful literary agents in New York City and perhaps the world. Her literary agent also represents Murakami, Toni Morrison, Bret Easton Ellis, people of course significant renown, and Little Brown of course is a very powerful publisher. So the pieces were already in place for this book to be promoted on television and by way of television interviews, all the major magazines. McNally Leibowitz photographed her for Vanity Fair. This was all planned. I would have loved to have had the chance for Vanity Fair, but that's another story. But it was just destined for success, if you will.
Although sometimes that happens, and then
Right, it's true.
Also
It's
true.
the exact same. Well,
Well,
it was
never
actually
the
a
exact
Netherlands
same.
thing.
I can't believe
It's
the
rare.
publisher
It's
let the Netherlands publish it first. Can you imagine Little Brown Deer? It's weird.
Yeah.
Translation.
And the exhibition that took place at the Frick was just happenstance. It was not planned.
Yeah, like at a certain point, you can set everything up, and then it flops. But so at a point, talking about all the book does matter.
Yes.
So true.
I mean, we were gathering all these books, and I thought, and we were talking this morning, we were going around the bookstore and gathering books, and I thought, guys, we're not talking about what's inside the book, even as we were choosing the books. And yeah, you have to set everything up, but if it's a hard fall to a bad book.
It's funny because this book did come out in the fall of last year, and it's, as I was telling these guys before, it's like it's become like a kind of case study because in the fall everyone publishes their really big, what they perceive to be their really big, literary books that they want to sell through the holidays, and their big history, and their big kind of celebrity books, and so every publisher came to the table with their $1 million project, and that they were hoping was going to be a big success, and this is the one that just dominated the season and continues to go on. But all of them came with like elaborate marketing campaigns and blurbs that Sarah loves so much, and all of those things, and all of this great anticipation about everyone's gonna review it, and and just it was this one that worked, and which interestingly the lesson inside the publishing house was very similar to what you're saying, which is that the book really matters. The thing itself between the covers matters, and for editors that just kind of put to us as this mandate, which is great because it's the opposite of what people think happens in publishing houses, which is that just to affirm the idea that the book has to be the thing that you can win or lose. The marketing thing is almost like a machine that it goes into, but it does have to. And Donna Tartt, for all of her like The Secret History and all of her sales in the Netherlands, her last book did not work, and people were, because it didn't take on that word of mouth, it didn't become that phenomenon, and people who didn't normally read books didn't read it, and which is, the case here is you have non-readers who've come to it, and that's the thing that really makes a difference between a huge success and a moderate
Not
success. Infrequent
non-readers, but
readers.
readers that have to be convinced to read.
Right, or cued by the Pulse, or cued by some other.
Right, which is totally understandable. I mean, I think
Absolutely.
I'm like that with television. I watch maybe one show a year. I mean, I really need the push. Okay, well, should we? Okay.
It seems almost. I wonder if
one
Little
more
Friend
question about Donna Tartt. Don't you feel like she was a little bit of a comeback kid? Because I got that flavor from some of the advance, like from some of the interviews, it's like, oh, the last book was hardly mentioned, but the secret history was really, really mentioned. And it was like, can she come back now, 11 years later? Did anybody get that? No.
Well, I think no one mentioned the middle one because no one. It would have meant nothing to anyone.
I tried to.
So,
And the editors with whom I spoke after the exhibition came out, of course, did express significant gratitude to the Frick for making that happen.
Glad they worked that out.
Though now it seems like it may be, I mean, I don't know how much the sales in our store are representative of the general, like, national trends or international trends. It seems like it might be getting its reconsideration based on what I see in our store. I've noticed the crest,
Yeah,
like,
it's what?
obviously
Is
the
it
Goldfinch was so big
research?
through the holidays, and then we put the secret history back out on the front table because the Goldfinch, you could barely, there was a time that the publisher was out of stock. We didn't even have it because nobody did.
In 20 years, anyone under 40 didn't read The Secret History 20 years ago.
Yeah. But now I've seen the secret history taper just a little bit, and the little friend has appeared on the table. And
That's great. That's like the dream,
People
That's
like
why I keep publishing people sometimes. You're like, the one that sells is going to then pull the entire backlist off.
Yeah.
It's certainly my dream for certain authors.
Did everybody love every moment of this book? I could have shot
Suspect you didn't.
myself on
there's I'm going to say a consensus of dissensus around the Las Vegas portion, especially. That seems to be, if there's any portion of the book that I've heard more than any other, that people are sort of, I don't know, not buying it or not as swept up by.
I didn't like some of the characters.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have to be wonderful characters.
Right.
But I was so sick of Boris by the time he,
This is the Pen Festival. Can you talk a little bit about literary translation? I am a literary translator.
Are you? We do a lot. We do so much. In our stores, translation is obviously huge for us. What do we have here in translation? Shoot.
Actually.
Yes.
Chinese translation.
Kenny is translated.
The Beauvoir. And the Beauvoir.
And oh, look.
Oh, okay.
So, this book. Why did this book work? This is 2666 by Bolaño.
It's got a rockin' good cover.
It's got a what?
A rockin' good cover.
It did, and when the hardcover, they did. Jonathan Glassy, the publisher of FSG, says that he thinks it would have for sure been on the bestseller list, but they published the hardcover in 2 formats simultaneously. They did the hardcover, and then they did a box set of 3 paperbacks, which was it was beautiful. It was really amazing. But okay, here's a book in translation, and Bolaño had been around for. I first read Bolaño. I was reading New Directions anthology, and they just had short stories by various people, and it was long before he was picked up by FSG, and he just had, I think, 3 books out. And I saw a short story of his that was from Last Evenings on Earth, and it was dynamite. It was electrifying to read this. I mean, it almost felt like the first time I read Salinger. It had that same limpidity and effectiveness. So I immediately went and read the short story collection. When was this? This was ages ago.
Yeah, we had
It was
our
2005.
first international book club.
By Night in Chile. We read By Night in Chile, which is a complicated book. It's all one paragraph, and it's
Like a stream of consciousness monologue, even, right?
Yeah, and it was a stream of conscious monologue by a person who was very dishonest with himself and had sort of colluded with the regime in Chile. So, and then he kind of just buzzed along, and there was a certain amount of awareness of him, but not a lot. And then suddenly, FSG published Savage Detectives first, which was. It's like he's just so good. All bets are off. I mean, it's like if he didn't rise, there's no justice in the world. So it's not even almost worth talking about why it worked.
Although there is a story and a mythology around him that I think helped. There's a story you could tell about him.
And different translators too.
That's true.
New Directions is still using their translators. I mean, is that? I mean, it might be an interesting case study because of the way that, like you're saying, that it was sort of New Directions, and then all of a sudden FSG.
But then a perfect parallel would be Javier Marias, who was the exact same New Directions author, who was, famous amongst people who were interested in European literature and what's happening around the world in general. And Knopf picked him up and put a lot of money and energy into him, and it didn't really work. The Infatuations didn't work in the way that Savage Detectives did, and then 2666, which was huge. I mean, for a very long book that It's very weird and very difficult. I mean, I read it right.
And impossibly violent.
Very violent. I was reading it when I was nursing my son, and I thought, what am I doing? It's like hundreds of pages that are just about women being raped and murdered in the desert. I mean, it's really, why? Why books in translation? I think with books in translation more than there's a sub-community that obviously I think our store serves very well, that buzz can go around, but it's very few rise above it. And I don't know, it's not like this in other countries. I mean, every time I go to Paris, I'm so amazed at how international their bookstores are. And just in general, how interesting their publishing is compared to ours. I mean, really publishing into an environment of, like, an assumption that people are smart and intellectually engaged and talking about ideas. It's like you walk into a bookstore in Paris and that's what the publishing feels like. Whereas you walk into a bookstore in America, that is not the assumption that publishers seem to be working on. And it's actually, sometimes when I'm in Paris, I just get so frustrated with being stuck with American publishers and with trying, and I
Try being the translator.
Yeah, and then trying to
say about being in-house. I mean, School of Girl hasn't published very much.
No, not at all. One of the problems is you have to have readers who are competent to read in the original languages. In a lot of cases, we don't get a lot of works in translation translated. And so some publishers, I think, have that advantage because they have really good readers who can read in languages. The other thing is, there is like a difficulty in terms of audience and in terms of getting. We have published some works in translation. In nonfiction, but then you have the issue of, so we have an author who's in Germany. We have to bring him over from Germany. His English is maybe not great, although even if he speaks English, his English is not great. It's just, you have several hills to climb in terms of getting to a place where a company like Random House can put its machine into motion around that book, because its machine is built for certain kind of expectations what an author can do.
Don't you feel like lots of books fail? Lots of books by white women fail. Lots of books by whomever fail. But it's like a short story collection fails, and publishers are like, wow, short stories collections fail. Or a book in translation fails. They say book in translation fail because there's already a bias against these things that is confirmed.
Well, in part, I think it's the way that the machine, as I was saying, there is it is a machine, and there's a machine that's sort of built for certain things, and even when those things fail, they go smoothly through the machine.
And Spiegel and Grau is like that if you're a part of Random House, you're going to let Vintage do the translation, and you're not going to take that on, or is it?
No. I think if we saw the product that we wanted to do, we would compete with even our in-house, other in-house imprints for those books. But I also think a big part of how works in translation get published in this country is through relationships with foreign publishers. And that's something that takes a certain amount of time, cultivation, travel, and so you have to kind of commit to it. It's something you do, and you can't do it in a kind of one-off way. So either you're kind of doing it or you're not doing it. And again, like with something like as you say, like all kinds of fiction fails, all kinds of nonfiction fails, but it fails as part of the course of business rather than as another business that you've entered, without. A lot of expectation of success. So it's tough. It's tough. And I do think there's also it's such a lively, there's a lot of work that gets published in English, like a lot of work gets published in English. There's no shortage of works in English. And I think, I think part of it is that there's maybe a lack of curiosity among American readers and maybe a lack of ambition among American publishers. But I also think that there's just a tremendous amount of work that's there to be read already for English language readers, which is not necessarily the case when I talk to foreign publishers. They are operating a lot of times with a more limited number of books, so they do have to publish a lot more translation than we do. And also because of all the cultural hegemony of the English-speaking world, they have to kind of know about things that I think American readers don't feel like they have to. To their detriment, perhaps.
Okay. So one thing we thought it would be interesting to talk about is publishing books on difficult subjects, which Americans are notoriously bad at buying. There hasn't really been a huge book on the fact that we might be entering environmental apocalypse, except for Al Gore, which had a lot going for it, documentary,
presidential
presidential campaign. Yeah. The stolen election. Yeah.
One of the most famous people in the country right now.
Right, it had a lot going for it. And so I don't have any answers for why these things, there's been no cancer book that has really, really worked, although there's been some excellent ones that have been excellently reviewed. There's just subjects that people don't feel comfortable reading about. And the most obvious seems to me, maybe just because of my interest, the environment. Obviously we have a problem, I think everybody knows, and yet all of the books sold, none of them are about this obvious problem or what we can do. And so here are 2 books that, these are some ideas. So The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert, her books do kind of sell. And this one's called The Sixth Extinction, and it's talking about, and it's a national bestseller right now, which is why it's 20% off at our store. That was not an advertisement. It was just explaining the sticker. National bestseller, 20% off. And it's not really a personal book. It's about how we might right now be facing kind of a global extinction. And here's when Tom's River, which is not really selling, the reviews were formidable, and it's a very personal story about a river. Won the Pulitzer Prize, still isn't selling. This one didn't on the bestseller list. This one did, not on the bestseller list. And it's a very personal story about, children with cancer and all sorts of really gruesome, sad things. And it's just an interesting thing that I don't know if that is true internationally, but it seems like we have a very hard time in this country with subjects that feel depressing, personally depressing. And the only way to go at the environment is in, The World Without Us did well, which was a book that imagined if we went extinct, what would happen? Which again, I think is so impersonal, it's easy to take. Does anyone have any thoughts on this?
I have a question. So The Sixth Extinction got good reviews, a lot of attention.
And she always does.
Yeah.
And she's got the New Yorker platform.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So do you think that's what made the difference?
Maybe, although this one also got extraordinary reviews and won the Pulitzer Prize.
Right, I know.
But everything else in the Pulitzer Prize went up onto the bestseller. This one didn't.
But I can't help but think that we're living in this ever increasing visual age. I mean, my eye went right to that yellow cover.
Aha.
It's 20% off. Tom's River looks great, and I'm familiar with it was well reviewed, but as a book buyer, just it's like a millisecond that you scan the table.
Yeah, it doesn't look great. And the title is also not very.
Well, there's something about the layout of that cover that just does not work for me. But I would still flip it over and read. But if I didn't if I wasn't in the mood for ecological disaster, then I would just say, I'll wait for the paperback. I mean, I don't mean to be a smartass about that, but it's true.
But now, see, I actually like the cover of Tom's River more than The Sixth Extinction.
I mean, I don't hate the cover.
That actually draws me in and goes, okay,
Just saying.
what is this story?
Really?
Yeah, it absolutely does. But I tend to be more of a traditionalist. I tend to read 19th century literature. I don't tend to read the latest book out. Do you know what I mean?
Is there an aesthetic?
There's
of the
an
cover?
aesthetic to it. There's a peacefulness to it and a beauty to it, and the beauty is what draws me in, as well as, of course, the location. You go, oh, Tom's River. Is that
New Jersey?
New Jersey? I know people in Tom's River. I have known people in Tom's River. But beyond the locality, it's the beauty that draws me in.
I'm sure that's why they designed it that way. But it's funny because for me it just doesn't. Just feels like it's going to be a dull book.
To me, the cover looks very generic.
It could be any kind of book.
Yeah.
You don't know what it's like.
You can't
Is it a
really
novel?
tell.
Is it
That's
nonfiction?
true.
Is it what
You
is
can't
it?
really
Is it
tell.
a memoir?
It could be anything.
It could
It
be
could be.
anything. Whereas The Sixth Extinction, it's very clear what it
Yes.
is. The cover tells you what it's about. And Colbert is a name. What's the Elizabeth Colbert?
But it also seems like the difference between these two books is one is intellectual, conceptual, which is emotionally safer than an intimate story of death. And
That's what
I
I think
think
too.
we as a culture are afraid of that. It's too intimate. It's too much to handle.
And also how much of this of people in the United States avoiding difficult topics. I know that when I was personally a younger woman, I was always out there going, ooh, this is really interesting. And I was much more cutting edge, and then life hit me, you know.
Enough.
And exactly, it's just enough. And I went through a really hard period of time, and I was like, I can't read that now because I've got to build myself back up personally. And I'm now at that point personally, where now I'm starting to go into more challenging literature. Do you know what I mean? But how much of it is?
They do say that in the entire world, the people who exhibit most signs of stress are middle-aged American women. Yeah.
So they don't need Tom Sawyer on top. I think it's interesting. One of the things we talked about yesterday was we were talking about the Piketty book, and I think it's very similar in some ways to the Sixth Extinction in the sense that when you have these problems that feel like they are intractable problems, you don't necessarily want to read a narrative that reminds you that it's an intractable problem. You want something that's going to somehow formulate some new way of thinking about it, or that might even be a way out of it, or at least formulate some new, you know. And I think the Sixth Extension seems to promise, even just in the visual of it, like it promises that maybe this is a new way of thinking about this thing that otherwise feels inevitable and depressing for that reason. And I think
But it's also the subject is much more interesting. I mean, if you compare the subject of this and the subject of dying from cancer, you know, there is very little.
I'm sorry, the subject of what?
The previous book that you had.
Right.
Tom's River.
But Tom's River has a pretty uplifting subtitle. It's the story of
Stories of
salvation.
science and salvation.
Science
The community
and
really did
salvation.
come
It
together and do
sounds very
something.
uplifting.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know the story.
But how can you tell from the cover because that is so far down?
It's super tiny.
Absolutely.
And just like if you're passing it in that millisecond on the table, it could completely roll by you.
Yeah.
And it feels slightly cliche too, like the sort of science and
true.
salvation, so you don't feel like you can believe that premise. You know, like,
It's a very tiny.
And it's, I mean, and his publisher is Bantam, and I wouldn't say the Bantam specialty.
that's their first Pulitzer Prize ever.
Yeah, I believe it. Sorry. Okay, so here is Capital, which, as in my memory, correct me if I'm wrong, the last big best-selling academic book of this caliber that I can remember is A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. It's been years, and this, I had dinner with this translator a few nights ago, and he said it's sold 85,000 copies so far, and it's out. It would have sold more. It's out everywhere. The publisher's running out. They've ordered, I think, 250,000 copies more printing. It is enormous. It's just an enormous phenomenon, and we, three of us, talked yesterday about why this might be, and I think that this book did something which Goldfinch also did, which is rose out of the book pages. The book pages are obviously not what they once were. I mean, even the front page of the New York Book Review does not warrant, that front page review does not enter top news in the Times, does not enter top news when you look at it on the on any iPhone app, and is relegated to a corner if you look at it on the internet. The book pages do not seem to, my store is 10 years old, and it used to be that the front page of the New York Book Review was every week. It felt a little bit like an event. There was a little bit of excitement. I always wanted to see what was on the front page of the book review, as did customers, and that just doesn't really happen anymore. I mean, we don't feel the excitement among customers. I don't really care anymore what's on the front cover of it. And this book really rose. There were lots of off-the-book coverage of him, partly because of Krugman, but even larger, I think, because of his bold invocation of Marx, maybe? Don't know. What were you going to say?
What's interesting about that is in the world of theater, this has also shifted. It used to be that if you got a rave review in the New York Times for a Broadway show or an off-Broadway show, it was a qualified hit. And it was very interesting with a brilliant production of an unusual musical, Finian's Rainbow. It got a love letter from the New York Times, and it died so quickly, and it was beautifully done as a musical, but it didn't have that import at all.
I've noticed that because it used to be when something got a rave review from the New York Times, you try and call to get tickets, and good luck. And now you get a rave review, you can always get a ticket.
Yeah,
it's no problem.
exactly. It's the same thing with the theatrical.
Well, what does that say about the import of the New York Times?
Yeah,
Except David Hook's column in the New York Times talked about this book in a very interesting way, at the same time as a lot of other people from different political perspectives.
Exactly.
Every
And
one
this
of their
is
op-ed
and
writers
this
wrote
is
something about it.
everyone. This is off. This is what I'm talking about. Off the book page coverage is what made it. I mean, if it was, I don't think it would have made. If it was just in the cover of the New York Times Book Review, I doubt it would have had the impact. And in fact, yeah, and it's interesting. In France, it hadn't even been really selling in France. And now it is. It is, doubled back to France apparently. But
Yeah, I think there's probably two things that were going on with this book. So I remember the first time I read about it, it was in just a column in the business section, or an article in the business section that was talking about it, and it kind of talked about the central idea of the book. As long as the book isn't as complicated as this, it has a very clear kind of takeaway for readers. It feels fresh, and again, it's about a subject that has emerged as like one of the primary subjects that we're grappling with in this country. And he had a new and portable kind of formulation about like what was causing it and what would perpetuate it and what could possibly solve it, however improbable. And I think that makes a huge difference for a book that's on a difficult subject. It's like we were talking about the new Jim Crow, which is a book about mass incarceration, another subject that people don't necessarily want to talk about but are aware that it's happening. But she found a way to conceptually kind of make it portable, and which allowed her to go on television shows, and those people can take the story forward, and more people become engaged in something that otherwise they thought they maybe wouldn't have wanted to. And then it becomes part of this conversation that everyone feels like they have to be informed about. That's the other, I think, similarity between it and the Goldfinch, is that everyone's talking about it and you start to feel like an idiot if you don't know about it. You feel like you have to kind of get on top of that.
What did these translators say?
About what?
You were saying you took a dinner with the paper, right? And what, does he have
Lots of
anything-
different things.
Why does he think it jumped off the book page?
Why does he think it jumped off the book page and into popular consciousness? I mean, he thinks that, and I think that there's a consensus that all of us are aware that we have a major problem with wealth inequality in this country. And there hasn't been any way, I mean, Occupy Wall Street was fundamentally alienating for most people. And it was so tied up with, homelessness and really a kind of protest that a lot of people don't feel comfortable with. Fair enough? He's David Graeber's editor, who was one of the kind of starters of Occupy Wall Street, so maybe we'll disagree to disagree on this one. And one of the people who really kept it rooted in the anarchist movement, which, again, I think was a mistake, but I don't know.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think Piketty would have happened without Occupy.
You don't think it would have happened without Occupy Wall Street?
No, I don't think wealth inequality was
on the
on the
radar.
agenda
I guess
for
that was my
Occupy.
question about the translators. I mean, obviously Harvard was caught off guard by the success by
Yes.
leaping off of the
Yeah.
pages, even though, Krugman's been talking about him since long before this was published. So, I'm just wondering, if they've had any sense, I don't know.
They didn't expect it. They didn't expect it. They knew it was going to be big. They knew it was going to be a big academic book. Their program was big,
this
but
is not the kind of book that normally gets translated.
even by Harvard University Press.
I don't think the University presses really publish very much. They publish their professors' translations. And I don't know, does he teach it?
No,
Yeah.
he teaches that in Paris School.
Right. So I think this is.
Well, the interesting thing, so the interesting thing about this is I kind of think that books like this, it's just like, say Barack Obama hadn't come. Say we never had Barack Obama for that election. What would have happened? We would have elected somebody maybe with less passion and less excitement. Maybe it would have been Hillary. Maybe it would have been as exciting. It's unclear. But Barack Obama really, his leadership or his speech giving or something really captured the whole country. Even, Republicans were captured by him. And I feel like if this book hadn't came, there wouldn't have been a book on wealth inequality that would suddenly be selling an academic book on wealth inequality that would have been selling hundreds of thousands of copies. I think the country was ready, but then it's also, you need the spark. And the spark often, I don't think the spark has been ignited in a lot of difficult subjects yet. But, yeah.
This one to me seems like it is lending a concrete language to talk about something going on in this country that nobody yet really has a good grip or understanding of yet. You know what I mean? There are lots of books on economics that are coming out. There are lots of books coming out about inequality and injustice that are appearing right now. A lot of them are, kind of just indexing a problem, like pointing at it, diagnosing, saying this is a big deal, this is a big deal, this is a big deal. But it often relies on like the author's like style or erudition and doesn't necessarily like deploy like the range of scope and range of material evidence that he has in this case to really make it like a systemic study, but also I think to really like give proper names to something that like American readers sort of like feel going on, but don't again have the language to look at. Like we were talking in the context of literature, sometimes you pick up a book because you wanted to be able to articulate something about your own experience that you don't have the language for yourself, you know. And in a way it makes Piketty literature, right? He's found a way to like formalize and make something concrete, talking about a history of wealth accumulation that people sort of have, you know, a kind of like shadowy awareness of. We're becoming a little bit more aware of it here in this country. You know, one of the major like talking points about this book that I have seen in all the reading that I've done is the ways in which it provides like very like material formulations for talking about like numbers and size and amassments of wealth that people hear. Like there's a 1%, they have a bunch of money, we don't have as much money. And then but then it's, you know, but like we're still like struggling for a language. Like part of Occupy's thing that was both a blessing and a curse was that it started opening up a desire and a demand for like a type of language, but didn't have sort of like the analysis yet to come up behind it. You know what I mean?
Or, like one large speaker who could articulate everything, and that people could then identify.
Well, I think it's also just it takes it beyond rhetoric.
Like with No Logo.
Oh, right, yeah, good point. Naomi Klein, Acadian, wasn't it?
I mean, I haven't read it yet, so I'm...
It's hard to get. I mean, they're hard to get. We keep running out. We bring in 100, they're gone.
But anyway, I sort of sense that this might be a similar thing just 20 years later.
And then there's another phenomenon with, I think, political books, or books that have some kind of political application, which is that people vote in a way by buying the book, and they don't necessarily have to read the book. You know, but by possessing the book, it becomes like a totem of their beliefs. And on the right wing, you see this happening not in your store at all, but if you look on but you look on the bestseller list, there's always like these books that are just clearly not books, and if you actually try to read them, they're not books. They could be blank pages, but it's a way of saying, I really hate Barack Obama, and so, and won't it be funny to see this book on the bestseller list? So, this book of blank pages.
I have a question about your decision to do self-publishing and publishing on demand, and the whole program that you have within your bookstore to where people can speak to, get coaching on how to put a package together for self-publishing and the movement of self-publishing in the country and in New York as a whole. I think it's fascinating.
What's the question?
Just basically what brought you to make the decision to have, is it called the book machine, I think?
Oh, yeah, I did. I did ask backwards,
and also
really.
how successful it is.
Yeah.
And the other question, does it sometimes lead from like a self-published
Okay, yes, I can answer all of these questions. Seems slightly off the topic, but I'm happy to answer all of them. So I did ask backwards. I got the machine because you can print public domain books on it. Mm-hmm. And I thought that this was something that with so many universities in this city, people would just be lining up saying, print me that 1908 treatise on what, housewives or whatever it may be.
Lining up. It's amazing the stores in business.
At Harvard Bookstore, they do it. But, so I was wrong. And I'd say the book machine is probably 2% public domain stuff, maybe less. It's tiny. But yes, it's a success. It's less than 5% of the revenue of the store, but it's profitable. We have 2 full-timers working on it, always. And, so it's interesting. A lot of stores across the country who had the machines have gotten rid of their physical machines. North Shore Books just did it. Village Books just did it. And Bookshop Santa Cruz decided never to get one and just start a self-publishing program. So these stores have just set up self-publishing desks. I love having the machine, and our machine does very well. We have a ticker over it, which was inspired by McDonald's, how many books we've printed. It's, I think it's 39,000 books that it's printed in 2 years or something. It does a lot, and we do fun things with it. The woman who manages it is who just published her own novel, actually, she, not with us, but with a publisher, who's an extraordinary woman. And also, in my other store, we sell her art. She's also an artist, and she's also a designer, and she does a lot of the design work with the people. She, just last week, she designs little journals that we print and sell, and just last week, or 2 weeks ago, she sold her thousandth, you know what I'm trying to say, journal. And so we do a lot of fun things with it, and I love having it there. I mean, technically, since we do our larger print runs with another publisher, with another printer anyways, we don't need the machine, but for me, I love it. I mean, it makes money for us, not huge amounts of money, but it is profitable. And it's it's just exciting. It gives someone who I really admire, who on our staff, a creative outlet to do her journals, which if we were doing stuff off-site, we wouldn't do. And I think visually, it serves two purposes. One, obviously, as a bookstore, I'm very invested in the physicality of experience and a tactile experience. And I mean, and that's with my other store that I've opened, which I do is the Goods for the Study store, is further on that model, to actually sit at a desk and use a good pen and write in a nice paper, whatever it might be. I'm very invested in the tactile. And I think that the tactile is actually part of the reading life. And when we were talking about the difference between Tom's River and the Sixth Extinction, I thought, online would the cover be as important? And I was thinking while we were talking about it that there's something kind of sad to me that which I consider my store kind of a higher quality shopping experience than Amazon, but something as superficial as the cover might be more meaningful in my store than it is online, which I had a moment of sadness about that there. But the book machine, yeah, so it's mostly self-publishing, and we do everything. I mean, Chris's former assistant, a brilliant young woman, does developmental editing for some people who publish through us. And yes, there have been success stories. The New York editor for Paris Vogue, or the Paris editor for New York Vogue, I can't remember which. Whatever. She did these books called A Fashion Insider's Guide to New York, A Fashion Insider's Guide to Paris, and then she just did Fashion Insider's Guide to Miami. And those were picked up by Abrams, I think, and have sold extremely well. So it does sometimes, I think that's the largest success story, I think, from our machine, because we do all sorts of things. We do really all sorts of things
Yeah, speaking of that tactile experience, how much of those non-book sections of your store bring people to the books? Because you got a nice cafe, it's very relaxed. It's, you've got that gift corner as you go down the
But it's
stairs.
only stationery, it's not gift.
Not gift, but
which is, I think, for me, that's a very strong distinction, as so many bookstores around the country have moved to gift, but New York bookstores have not. I think
That's
New York
true.
bookstores are exceptional in that. I mean, New York bookstores are exceptional for that. Although it's not just New York. It's New York, it's San Francisco, it's Seattle, and Boston, and maybe Chicago. I just don't know. I mean, there's certain cities that have been immune to this, but there are very good bookstores in cities like Austin. Like Austin's bookstore, Book People, which is a great bookstore, and he sells an enormous amount of gifts. He's got a wall of socks. He's really deep into the sock market. He himself is always wearing crazy socks. And yet he's like a passionate book person. He does amazing things. He runs a summer camp for children that has which is around books. It has hundreds of children come through each summer. He named his store Book People after Fahrenheit 451. Yeah, he's great, but he sells. So it really runs the gamut. So I don't do gift. I only do paper. But what
Do you hear feedback from customers like, oh, I love these cards and now I'm buying Capital?
I mean, this again, I don't know if this is that interesting for people,
Maybe
but
you can't measure that stuff.
Well, what I feel is that the stationery section is very big for us. I mean, for our greeting cards, we sell between 4,000 to 5,000 individual greeting cards per month. It's huge, and we do extremely well in stationery, and I buy it all. I mean, I'm the buyer for the stationery, and it's something I take very seriously because I feel like when people come into a bookstore, there's no way. I mean, I'm a book buyer. I've been a book buyer for 10 years. I look at every year. I look at thousands and thousands of books and choose what to pick. And I even walk into my store and feel a little intimidated sometimes by not knowing what's going on. It's overwhelming. It's completely overwhelming. And so part of our job as a bookstore is to make people trust us. And I look at the stationery that I do as a way that people can see from whatever wit or taste that I may reflect in the cards and the stationery that I choose. It's a way of showing people that they can trust us. We don't have cards with bad jokes. We only have cards with good jokes, etc. Whatever it might be. So that's what I look at the stationery and the cafe, which I have to work on the kitchen. It looks like hell, but The cafe too. I mean, if you were to eat at our cafe, the food in our cafe, the quality is impeccable. It's really, I mean, I'm a vegetarian, so I haven't tried everything, but there's people I trust who've tried the meat dishes. And every 2 years I go to my cafe and I say, why is a bookstore in the business of killing animals? It's not right. And everyone looks at me with this again. But in any event, so the cafe, everything is really impeccable. And so it's the same, I mean, our egg salad is, I would say, the best in the country. Just putting that out there, the best.
You probably brew one of the best teas.
Thank you. Our tea
It's so exceptional.
Thank
the
you.
tea is just amazing.
Thank you very much.
It's not very easy to come by. In this
No, it's not. I'm a tea drinker, but too.
So am I.
Yeah.
I appreciate
So I think that I look at these things in the magazines too, which they all do make money. The cafe makes money, the stationery makes money, the magazines make money. I mean, there's not an unprofitable part of the bookstore except for the events probably are lose money, but they have a different function. Which I look at them as a way that just letting people know that this is an environment that is carefully considered and you can trust us. And
That's what it seems like.
so that's the point of for me, that's the point of the non-bookstore.
I wasn't criticizing it. I was just wondering how many people come in like,
No,
oh, I know Sarah's got these great cards that I never see anywhere else. By the way, you know, Donna Tartt, let's pick that up because it's 20% off.
Yeah, but I'm
there's
sure
probably
it
things that are probably hard
happens.
to enter.
And then I opened it, I mean, the stationery does well. I opened a second stationery store, but I wouldn't have put it in the bookstore because it's a bookstore. You can only do so much. So, but I did open a second stationery store. I don't know, I grew to love it. When I first opened the store, I remember when we had to buy stationery and cards, and I bought really the worst stuff, and I didn't like it at all. But it's something I've really grown kind of passionate about is paper and cards and stationery and pens. And, yeah.
What made you open the second store in Brooklyn?
Well, that's opening in February. I get the keys in November. I think it's an old steel factory that's being renovated, and when they're finished, they'll give me the keys. It was originally supposed to be April, then May, then suddenly November. So I don't know if I'll see when it opens, but I have a lease. What made me open in Brooklyn? I feel a certain responsibility to a number of communities as the largest independent bookstore in Manhattan. I feel a great responsibility to my booksellers. I feel a great responsibility to my customers, and I feel a responsibility to the city. And the neighborhood that my bookstore is in, rents are skyrocketing to a point where it's insane. They just rented out a little 200 square foot corner for $50,000 a month, a block away. And I fear I will lose my lease in 6 years, not because the bookstore is failing. The bookstore does very well. But there's a certain point where no independent business it's not a bookstore store, it's an independent business store. No independent business that doesn't control its means of production, right back to the factories in China, up to cookie cutter retail places with underpaid staff, can ever function. And an ability to lose money as having a store in downtown Manhattan as a marketing ploy, can afford the rent. And so I worry in 6 years that store won't exist. And so I realized that I looked into buying a building. It's totally, it's absurd. It's tens and tens of millions of dollars to buy a space. It's just beyond the purview of a normal person, which I am. And I decided that I really started thinking about how to make my store kind of more of a three-legged stool rather than this one teetering thing, dependent on one landlord who's a billionaire landlord, Abby Colenium, who doesn't give a damn about books, about anything, everything I ask him for, I want to get a liquor license so I can sell wine and beer during my events, and they said, okay, but we'll raise your rent too. So it's a taste of what's to come. And so I'm trying now to think about how the bookstore, which I think can represent something, can become a business larger than its location. So I opened the stationery store. Next week I'm opening an art store, which will be something that's sort of like an art gallery, but art galleries are just not accessible on a retail space. They're simply not. I mean, you have to go in, the prices aren't listed, you have to negotiate the price, you don't know how much they'll negotiate for. A lot of the work is in flat files, you can't see it. And so it's going to be a store that sells gallery quality work, but framed and priced, and from $100 to $25,000. So I'm looking at McNally Jackson and thinking, what we do well and what we bring to the city. I'm opening another bookstore in Williamsburg, and I don't know what I'll do next. I mean, maybe another bookstore uptown, maybe something else. But I just feel like we built this thing. I mean, Chris when we were married to work like a dog there. I mean, we built this thing. I worked like a dog to build this thing, and it matters. I mean, it matters having a space in this city. I mean, it matters. New York not having bookstores is bloody depressing. And so I just have to, even though it would be, I'm spending a lot of money doing it, it would be nicer just to put it in the bank in a lot of ways. I just feel like I have a responsibility to keep this store alive, and that is just by putting out legs in every direction I can, so it just finds stability. So Williamsburg is one step, and I don't know in 2 years what my next step will be, but that's, and these other little stores too, so it just to, I don't know, it'll all come together. I don't know. I'm kind of strategically setting out a lot of different things, but that's why I'm doing it. It's not because because part of me thought, life is great. I've got this great bookstore. People like it. People who work there are wonderful. Everything's wonderful. Why more of a good thing is not necessarily better, but I just want a feeling of security for a bookstore in New York. So that's why.
What's the address of your art shop?
It's going to be right next to the stationery store. There are going to be two matching storefronts on Mulberry between Princeton and Spring.
And how long is your lease in Williamsburg?
10 years. 10 years, and then I'll probably lose that one too. So I have 15 years at this one. We'll see. I mean, that's New York, though. So you have to be quick on your feet.
How did Good Lord Bird sell?
Okay, so this is interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good Lord Bird versus The Sun. Again, National Book Award winner. Great book.
Well reviewed.
Very well reviewed. Formerly best-selling author. The Sun, which sold better, was also. He used to be your author, right? Or Cindy's author. The Sun. This book. Has anyone read this book? I mean, it's just unreadable. I mean, by page 80, there have been so many children violently murdered. I just thought, I'm out. I just was out. There's only so much a person can bear, And and they're both on these. I mean, it's interesting as a Canadian coming in and looking about how these books, about like the founding of the American West and how brutal it was, like Blood Meridian as well, about how there's something that Americans there's something that they like touching the subject, just sticking their nose into it as if it's somehow, purifying, edifying, honest, something. But this one didn't, it was briefly on the bestseller list, not for very long. Do you know the numbers for it? No, it's Penguin. And this one I think the sales, which was Echo, were better. And it is just interesting why this one had humor, really a lot of humor, wit. It was interesting, it was different. Why didn't it sell?
Well, I think there's maybe two kind of American historical ethics that are side by side here. They sort of think of the West, and then a story that's more about slavery.
This was an epic of the West.
In its way,
Did
yes.
you read it?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
And it's funny, they're both former authors of Cindy's, Philip Meyer and James McBride. But I mean, I think a big part of the difficulty of when you publish African American writers is that there's a resistance to, although they did nothing to advertise the fact that James McBride is black anywhere. There he is. But
you didn't even put him on the back.
But also,
cover.
he's like a best-selling author. I mean, he did Color of Water, which is an amazing book, and people know he's biracial. But yeah, I do think it's kind of an interesting comparison. Philip Meyer is also more the sort of prototypical, and Philip, if you ever meet him, you see it in person, of like this kind of tough male American writer. He's been able to occupy that space, I think, which is like always a slot.
Like the Hemingway slot?
The Hemingway slot. And James McBride is a little bit more of an elusive character because his best-selling book was a memoir, and his fiction has almost like a satirical, it's got a playfulness to it, and a comic quality to it, which I think is also an impediment to like establishing something as high literature, because it's funny and playful. Also, even though it won the National Book Award, which doesn't sell books. So.
National Book Award does not. Yeah, somehow they really lost their ability to sell books. National Book Award.
Pulitzer sells books. National Book Award, for whatever reason.
The Pulitzer
tends not to, but not in this. Not for Thomas River.
It didn't help.
Or last year, Gilbert King's Devil On My Trail, whatever it's called.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're definitely seeing a diminishment of award ability. I think everybody knows that awards just aren't selling books.
I think the Pulitzer in fiction still sells. I mean, I think that is one of the few things that really does drive.
But the Pulitzer has a wide range. It's journalism, this other thing, and the
Right.
National Book Award is like the Oscars of the book world, which I don't think people are very familiar with.
Right.
Yeah, what do you think?
Right.
I mean, I think
Just
the Booker
saying.
the Booker Prize sells more copies in our store than the National Book Award. I don't know why. I really don't know why.
With Booker Prize, I think that's across the board. And Booker Prize sells more than National Book Award does.
But they've somehow, an award needs is also marketing. Somehow National Book Award is. Okay, so here's something interesting. So here are two books that, there's so many books here. Here are two books that Chris is working on. Here's one. This is Matt Taibbi. Do people know him? He's really the great citizen journalist of our time. He's extraordinary, and on the financial crisis, he's really been at every step, at the front, I think, as a journalist, speaking about it with wit, humor,
Vulgarity,
I was going to say it.
But also great reporting.
Really great reporting, and and people say he's lying. He says, "Fine, debate me. You just debate me." He'll challenge anybody because he knows his stuff cold. So there has been in my store. So I'm a big supporter of Matt Taibbi. My booksellers don't tend to know who he is because he writes for Rolling Stone, which he
used to.
Insistently did because Rolling Stone just had a larger circulation. And it kind of felt more. It kind of felt more relevant to the people than going to the New Yorker or the New York Times or something like that. So he's very much.
Also he had Hunter S. Thompson's job, and that was like a really big deal to him, and also the latitude to write in a language that people would actually read.
Yeah.
He's the one called
The Vampire
Squid. That's his term.
It's going to be on his gravestone. He said the other night.
Does everyone know that term, Vampire Squid? So what do people think of this cover? Does this appeal to anybody in this room? No?
Anybody in this room? You framed that question in an interesting way.
I'm sorry. This is
It's a great cover.
It's a great cover. No.
I love that cover.
No.
Really, what don't you like about that cover?
Well, maybe too far away, but it
That's
looks.
the problem. Closer, you'll love it. There's another copy here for the
I'm not the audience.
Right.
Do you like the cover?
Me?
Pass it around.
Yeah.
I don't know. I really don't know. I mean,
He does not like the cover.
He does not cover.
I don't
Evelyn.
cover it, no.
He loves it.
Can you say why? Would you be willing?
You hate it?
I hate it.
I think it's vibrant, energetic. I think it's weirdly beefy and kind of promises something that could be exciting.
Yeah. I saw this actually cover on Facebook a couple of weeks ago. I don't know who the author is, but the cover itself made me very interested in it.
It's an original piece of art by this artist Molly Crabapple, an amazing artist who became sort of the artist of the Occupy movement. And is also a kind of former burlesque dancer, and so all of her art has this kind of mixture of this kind of sort of agitprop style on one hand, but also has this element of burlesque to it, and which is very similar to Matt's style as a writer. He's got like this kind of serious element, of provocation in his work, but there's also like this kind of playful, inviting aspect to it, which is why we thought it was a perfect match. And she also did some interior art as well. She followed him on his reporting and did these pieces where she kind of so she's great, and that's why we chose her. And also, we didn't want it to look like another book on wealth inequality in a dry way. We were also not anticipating that Capital would become this enormous bestseller, and everyone would be talking about wealth inequality, so we felt like we had to find a way to distinguish it from some of the other books that had come out on the subject, which had sold no copies.
Don't you feel like it's the Rolling Stone version of that, right? This is what your father reads, and this is what your son reads?
Exactly. That's the idea.
So maybe it works, and I think it's a good example of how you have to, as a publisher, you really have to choose you got to choose your market in America, and it's annoying. I remember once we had an event with 3 black female writers talking about their books, and they were very different writers. It was Isa, Martha, and someone else. And all of their books were up front, and they were all published in the same season. They were very different books. They all looked the same. They all had this orange toned, murky picture of black women, orange tone. But you've got to choose your market. I think it's very hard this book is interesting. And it's interesting, I mean, I talk a lot about gender in publishing because I think in America, gender in publishing is extremely powerful. And it's very rare that you see a book by a woman that is published in a way that is not alienating to men. Mm-hmm. And that's when I made that comment earlier about Alice Munro, whose covers have become pink. Mm-hmm. They're pink. With photographs of ladies doing, peaceful things, And
then you have like the flamethrowers, which I think is an interesting.
Then you have the flamethrowers and Jennifer Egan.
Which I love that.
Yeah, the flamethrowers, and she's sort of tough. It's a good book.
I love her author photo. Her author photo is very badass too.
She's badass. I met her. She's very badass. Yeah. But
great reader.
Yeah, so it is. So it's interesting when you see this kind of novel that these. I mean, especially this book. It didn't make a decision on its market. I mean, it really left it.
That's changed.
Okay,
from the hardcover.
Right.
That's just
the cover is even more badass in a way.
Yeah, I mean, and
I gotta make this name.
yeah, and so it's interesting when you see an open-ended cover like this, and I think it's hard to do. And I remember talking to Jennifer Egan about Goon Squad in hardcover, which the cover was, I thought, ugly. It was this bizarre turquoise cover with an electric guitar, is that right? And yet it didn't alienate men, and Knopf made that decision, and I thought it was kind of exciting to see, and it worked. But then she said, and I talked to her about that, and she said, God, I just saw the paperback cover, and it is pinker. It is, although I think that they still kept the line sort of open. But here's an interesting book. This is a galley of a book that is trying to do that, it's also Chris's book, that is trying not to choose its audience, that is trying to leave it open to everybody. Don't know if it looks powerful or not, and it's really a gamble to do something like this. This is a book, it's a sideways landscape if you look at it. It's kind of powerful. The title is interesting, Just Mercy. What does that mean? It's interesting. It's two beautiful words, just and mercy. It doesn't skew, I don't think, too female, but it's definitely not male. But it really is trying to leave it open, and this is a book that is trying to be a book about an issue that people don't want to talk about, mass incarceration, capital punishment, and it's trying to be open to all comers. And the risk is that you miss everybody. Like Tom's River basically seemed to miss everybody in the room but you, and I think Tom's River tried to do something similar, but it just didn't. The risk is that you miss everybody, but you don't see this kind of thing a lot. You don't see this kind of thing a lot. And it can miss again. I mean, I think in Good Lord Bird, it missed, it didn't work, whereas that, and this is a book that again, it tried to be open to all comers, and it didn't work. Whereas this one did, and there's this, and then there's this book, which very strategically has chosen who his readers are. I think this cover, the confidence of this cover shows that the publisher, correct me if I'm wrong, knows who's going to buy this book and knows who his readers are. And so there's choices that are made at the cover level, and it's always a risk.
Regarding that gender sort of ambiguity, like with the Goldfinch, any idea of like the breakdown of sort of were there more male readers who bought the book than normal? I was just curious.
I would say it's safe to say that almost every novel written by a woman is never bought by a man. It's almost safe to say. It's a dramatic thing to say, but it's pretty much true. And then there are the exceptions, and the exceptions do seem to be dictated largely by packaging. By packaging, by the cover. There's this, like, New York Review of Books can sell, this book is so great, by the way, if you haven't read it, it's Speedboat by Renata Adler. This book, both men and we both read it. Because I even see that.
But I'm the exception to your rule. I read a lot.
Yeah, which is, and a lot of the male booksellers I've had to point out to them that they don't read women readers. It's very normal. It's very, very normal. But I think that publishers are playing into that. And there's that question, like when I first started talking, and I talked about working in history publishing and how doing a predictable cover helped the book find its market. And so it's a gamble in a way.
Yeah, I'm a writer, and my book just came out on Tuesday, actually.
Congratulations!
Thank you. It's called Where Earth Meets Water. It's published by Mira, and I ran into a very similar thing when they sent me, the cover the one cover option. It had an image of a woman on it, and I said, but my main character is a man. And they said, yeah, but that doesn't sell. I was like, yeah, but it's not about a woman. You know, there is a woman in it, but I struggled a lot with it. And
Did they change it for you?
No, I know. They said, well, we'll put a different woman on there. And I said, no.
You know, there was one book that I loved by Karen Connolly, who is really one of the great Canadian writers who doesn't have a lot of recognition down here. Some people are not. Maybe she has some recognition.
She's one of my favorite writers.
She's magnificent.
Yeah.
And she wrote a book about a Burmese prison.
Yes.
There was no female
That's
character in the
fabulous.
entire book. It took place in this horrible, horrible prison in which people were literally buried up to their ears in feces. I mean, it was just a dirty, disgusting, horrible book about torture. And I mean, also there are also good things about it. I should say I love this book. But the cover was this pink. This was your publishing house. The cover.
That was Nancy Lisa books. And we
Bought the paperback. Okay. And the cover was pink with flowers. It was oh dear God, it was
called The
horrible.
Lizard
She was a
Cage.
female writer. Huh?
The Lizard Cage.
The Lizard Cage.
Yeah, yeah.
Book.
It's such a great book.
But it was a
No one's heard of it.
No, so it was amazing. You read it.
I love that book.
It's sold a few thousand copies.
Yeah.
Yeah, sold a lot.
You know, the thing that struck me, I was trying to figure out why I liked and didn't like that book cover.
The Divide, and why you like
because it reminds me, the white on that reminds me of some of the books you see that have something like, it says autographed, you know, the paper thing that you put around the book that says...
The belly band?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what that reminds me of. Just
This part reminds you of a belly band?
Yes.
And you don't like belly bands?
There's something I like, I'm sort of between I like it and I don't like it. And I was trying to figure out why I'm not wild about it. And I think it's that...
So this just feels sort of artificially
You know what we wanted to do? We wanted to do like just a full bleed of the art and not have, and then have like this was like we, meaning the author and I, and then have the title like on the back or something.
You did
somehow
this with the book.
hide
It didn't work. You did that with that comic book.
Well, no, we actually had a belly band, a hated belly band for that book. But yeah, no, I agree that it kind of, it's not great, I think, having that huge band of type in the middle there, but we had a lot to say about it.
Okay. So what do you want to talk about now? I mean, here's an interesting thing. Oh, do you want to talk something?
Oh no, I wanted, like, because I'm still struck by this photo, because her photo has changed between the hardcover and the paperback. I'll send it around. But now it's not just a close-up author image. It's actually her standing in front of a car with a California license plate. And it's kind of a sexy-looking car. And she's got kind of a sexy pose.
And she's wearing a miniskirt.
But it's making me think about the entire book package again, and like the incredible way that this book sort of threaded the needle in terms of selling a book by a female writer that features like a strong female character.
Strong?
I mean, central. A central female character. Yeah. But
Well, that's a provocative image. I mean, the woman with the muzzle.
Right.
And it conjures up time.
Yeah.
And the title,
Yeah.
I mean,
it all kind of works.
like with feminist art, with this sort of...
Right, yeah.
Which you don't see a lot of anymore.
But to me, I mean, that image, that photographic image is taken from a what do you call a dissident newspaper in Italy in the 70s, right? So it's already got a sort of like radical political, association with it. It's got a very sort of like masculine coating to it, and it's interesting, like what a strongly masculine looking cover it is, and in a way, even how much like the author photograph is appealing to
men,
an imagined male reader.
I saw her read such a juxtaposition, the author photo and the front.
I know, like your mouth is muzzled, but your legs are right.
Exactly. she's like an ad for a car on the back.
Yeah.
No, she is. She's like a woman in a miniskirt standing in front of the Chevrolet.
And that's actually some of the tension in the book.
Yeah.
And it's weird. The book is not about a car. It's about motorcycles.
Right.
They have her in front of a car.
They have wheels.
But
if I saw her at a reading in that bookstore down on Main Street in Dumbo. I can never remember. Powerhouse, right? And I expected sort of like this tough biker chick, and it turned out to be something else completely. I mean, she's very bright, very smart, terrific writer. But like when I picked up the book originally in hardcover, I was like, well, yeah, this woman's been raised by the Hells Angels. But clearly that didn't happen. It was like, just didn't happen.
Yeah.
felt like a weird misrepresentation.
Well, she did. Yeah. Okay. Well, here's some other. I mean, I just thought it'd be interesting. Actually, these two books with that book as three novels that have sort of very literary fiction, all of them that have kind of risen to the top in the last year and a half, 2 years. There's The Orphan Master's Son, which people love. I mean, they're passionate about this book. I liked it. I didn't love it. And it was about, for those who don't know, it was about North Korea. It was written entirely from the perspective of a North Korean. It took place in North Korea. It was depressing, as you can imagine. Not a lot of happy stories seem to be coming out of North Korea for quite some time. And it was written by, this like nice California guy with all these like 4 kids or something, and it was bizarre, big, just like a big jolly dad type, and he did this, prison camps and hunger and everything. And then there's this book, which seemed to appeal, was a baseball novel, which seemed to appeal more to younger readers. Kind of, he was one of the founders of N+1, and so sort of his hipness sort of radiated out and made it. Huh?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You don't think?
Fine. Go ahead.
Okay. His hipness sort of radiated out, and got further and further from kind of that N+1 locus. And then there's The Flamethrowers, which. I mean, this was one of the books that I think the Paris Review got behind her and had a party for her. So it's kind of a different kind of a more genteel hip than the N+1 hip. But it's just, and I was thinking about these books. I was walking through this, thinking about this thing that we were going to do this morning, and I was walking through the bookstore and looking at the books that have worked in the literary fiction that has worked, which is obviously the exception to the rule. Let's put the Goldfinch out there too, and they all do have some kind of real world hook in a way. They all do speak to interests outside of art in a way. I think they're all presented. We all know clearly, whether or not you've read any of these books, you all kind of know clearly what part of a person they're appealing to, as not as a reader but as a person. There's a lot of people who didn't read this book because it was a baseball novel, which frustrated fans of the book who saw it. I mean, everything's a something novel. It just happens to be a baseball novel. It frustrated fans of the book, but it clearly was addressing something that lived beyond people's appreciation of the poetry of the language or whatever it might be. And I think it ties in with what we were talking about with covers, which in a way I wish they'd just go away. I mean, not to keep going on and on about France, but the books there, they all look pretty much the same, and it's kind of nice, man, woman, whatever, immigrant, not, whatever it might be. The books all look sort of the same, and it's neutralizing. You feel like they're speaking to you as a reader, and as a reader. That's what I feel like in a French bookstore. I feel like I'm being spoken to as a reader and as a thinker. And in a bookstore in America, I feel like I'm being spoken to as a woman who identifies with certain kind of patterns. Maybe I'm kind of a feminist, and so because I'm a feminist, I'm more likely to read books by men, oddly. And there's all these funny ways that I'm being addressed. And yeah, it's kind of disheartening.
There was a question.
I had a question specifically about The Art of Feeling, because in that case there was a big sort of story around Chad Harbach himself and his enormous advance, and there was the long Vanity Fair ebook that was sort of the story of his path to publication. And it seems like sometimes people want to talk about the book without really talking about what's inside the book. And do those stories tend to translate into sales, or do people just gossip about it?
I think this is exactly what we were talking about with Capital, about when a book actually leaves the book page ghetto. It makes a big difference. And I think when you have a book that speaks to something beyond the art of fiction, then it leaves the book pages as a result, which I think all 4 of these books did.
Absolutely, and all of them, and it's funny that you mentioned that because I was thinking the same thing, that all of these are cases where the story of the author was part of what drove people's attention to the book. And I mean, Chad Harbach being particularly like this kind of case study in how book buzz is created, how books are acquired and edited and became, and And in some ways, that's what drew people to the book, was that it was him. And I think the same thing's true with Rachel Kushner, same thing's true with Donna Tartt. And to some degree, this was the exception because no one knows who Adam Johnson is. But it won the Pulitzer Prize.
And and the North Korean thing was so weird.
And it had like a news, which was that people are interested in North Korea. And there's not that many books about North
it's
Korea.
hard to get in there.
But I do think that's a big part of it, and that's why when we're acquiring books, and this is the thing that's sort of disgusting about the way it works, is you have to have a story to tell about the author, and because that is your best shot at getting media that goes beyond review attention. And as we've kind of belabored, review attention is not going to drive sales as much. And that story can be simply that they're young and beautiful. That's the most common story for authors, is that they're young and they kind of fit
So
a
you
type.
have that going for you.
And like with Chad, there's the story of being the young intellectual who was, sort of, welcomed to the bosom of book publishing through what's his name at Little Brown and Michael Peach. And his agent was also a young, very good-looking, it was a completely photogenic setup. But they're all good. I like all these people. Let me just hasten to add. But yes, but that helped, and it's perverse, but that helps. That's what gave this book a leg up. It would not have happened if Chad himself was not, reasonably fit, if he didn't fit the description in the way that he does. And if his agent and author and publisher didn't, the book would not have, I don't think, succeeded nearly as well as it did.
And the other books his sort of set are much more, they don't try and be they aren't trying to be big books. They're trying to document the experience of young men in the city with the other one editors, their books and even their memoirs. And other books by kind of sad young literary men, which is actually a title stolen from that's actually a name of a novel by one of his colleagues. And so this one rose above, and I think it was a moment for a certain part of the culture to try and do something that was big and far-reaching and national, rather than kind of preaching to this community that is large, but a little bit insular.
I think we see too that we have just hit the moment in culture, the moment in history where an author's personality is essential, to the book as well, right? I don't know. It's not totally new, but when I think about how, social media presence, or I think about how the many different ways that readers come into contact with the author and the author's personality outside of just the book itself, I think that is often important to selling a book, having a sense for an unusual story. When we were talking about some of the international writers who've blown up, it's also because they have really compelling stories or personalities as well, right? That's clearly Roberto Bolaño has a whole mythology of heroin all the time and writing that poetry that he writes really excellently about. And Carl Knausgaard right now is the international man of letters, and he's also got this fabulously compelling story about writing this huge Proustian project about family members that are still alive or dead, but who are alive, who are upset, and all of Norway is reading this book.
Or even someone like Teju Cole, who through social media, this is kind of an amazing. He wrote, I think, a really great book.
Open City,
and his previous book is now coming out, or it's not. But Teju is a master tweeter, and through his tweets, I think he's built this amazing audience and a prestige that he did not get from his novel. I think on its own, when the novel came out, I think it was a semi-quiet event, but he's kind of built his reputation around.
And that novel hasn't gone away. I was talking to him last week, and I thought it's so strange that book just never went away. Most books, they come, they go. And that book just steadily,
but I think
and it might be the social
has
media.
A lot to do with it.
But also, I did another interesting thought about international fiction, which I find that customers are open to different kinds of international fiction from different countries. For French fiction, generally the only books that are published largely here, other than Welbeck, are women writing about romantic things, which I think this Simone de Beauvoir kind of fits into. Whereas for most countries, God, I'm harping about gender all the time, I'm sorry, women are not, they're just not in translation. I run an international book club at my bookstore, and we always read in series of 4. And so I'll choose, Japanese novels from mid-20th century, I'll read 4, or I'll read Mexican novels, whatever it might be, and we'll read always 4. And it's always a struggle to find any books translated by women, except for in French literature, because French women have a certain, je ne sais quoi that women from the Netherlands don't have here, according to us. Next one from the Netherlands. But it is interesting that there's just so much bias that goes into every level of publishing decisions. So we're almost out of time. Does anyone have any questions? We've got 5-10 minutes left.
I have to ask the Lumen question about ebooks and digital. And I just would love to hear. I don't have anything specific.
What's the question?
I mean, okay, where do you see the impact of ebooks in your bookstore and reading in general? And maybe in your personal opinion, like you read ebooks or?
I don't know, obviously. It's really the future through a glass darkly. I have long believed, and it seems to be now that facts are catching up with me, that ebooks will plateau, and they have plateaued. I don't know whether if Barnes & Noble closes, I think that will impact it enormously. I think if Barnes & Noble closes, ebook sales will go up very quickly again. There seems to be now the barrier of entry to being an ebook reader is very low. It's $99. It's a very low barrier of entry. So at this point, people who want it have it. It's not like there's nothing keeping people away from it. And all sort of studies seem to be bearing that out, that people who don't have it don't want it, because if they wanted it, they could get it for $99. And so I think we're at a moment of relative calm right now with that. I don't know how long it will last, and I think that factors in the industry will make a difference. So
it's interesting that when it comes to fiction, the numbers that we see are, at this point, particularly when it comes to genre fiction, the ebooks are just huge. Like they outsell the print books for genre fiction.
And genre fiction, I don't really sell that.
Which you don't sell, exactly. So it's interesting that I think the ebook reader has actually now fit a certain profile for certain kinds of books that they'll read. And we kind of anticipate that certain kinds of books are going to do really well in E. In other books, it's not so much the case, which is interesting.
Yeah, and it's a question, I think, too, of ownership. I mean, do you want to own a book or not? And you probably don't want to own a lot of romance novels or a lot of whatever genre you happen to read. I have one friend who is very, very booky. She's been a member of my book club for, I think, 8 years. And every time I recommend a book to her, she does the weirdest thing. She goes like this and smells it. She's really into the physicality of the book, but she has a Kindle and reads YA books on it, a lot of YA books, and she would never buy a YA book, but she'd never buy, but she wouldn't buy this book on e-reader because she wants, so I think that everyone's found their own relationship with it, because as I said, the barrier to entry is basically gone. So.
And then personally, do you?
I don't. I did briefly when I was breastfeeding, and I'd read on my phone because I was, you have to be in a dark room for hours. It's kind of, what are you going to do? But even then, I'd have the physical book in the living room for when I left his room. But for me, it doesn't work. I don't like it. But I also don't like chintzy, crappy, ugly plastic things, So it's a larger decision, a larger lifestyle decision.
I think there's still a basic truth about the form of the material book too, right? Like the codex form, it's also like a mnemonic device. Not only do you pick it up and you read it and you love it when it's nicely designed and you smell the pages and it's got French gilt pages or French cut pages or something, but if you're ever going to talk about it with anybody and you're going to recollect moments of the book that stick with you, you're going to think about where they occur on the page and where they occur in the book. Mm-hmm. I had a notable experience last year. I read Infinite Jest simultaneously, in material form and on an e-reader, because sometimes it's a big book and you don't want to get your arm work out on the train reading it, and also it's David Foster Wallace, so every fourth word you don't know, and it's nice to be able to hover over the text and immediately have the definition right there, and so I found it extraordinarily helpful. That's a really weird outlier experience. It's a 1,000-page book, and there are characters that you don't see for 200 pages, and you suddenly have to remember where they are, and then you can put your finger, on a character's name and find out where where they occurred 500 pages ago and be like, oh yeah, that's who that is, right? But that's a very specific kind of experience, and most of the time, if you read in that format, I find that I just don't have like the material experience of the book, not even in a romantic way, but in a very basic, memorable kind of way. If I want to talk to somebody, I can't remember where I saw something or when it happened in the book. And the book subsequently becomes less memorable to me.
See, because I understand exactly what you mean about the physicality of the book and going back but I find, is that a matter of the fact that we were all raised with books without all of this digital? Because I
just taught a class at NYU, and we asked the class.
Yeah,
none of them read on e.
Yeah. Really?
Yeah, and it was not the kids who were doing it. It's people who need large print.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or people who are just like high volume readers.
High volume readers.
Yeah. Read genre.
Anyhow, in short, I don't know, but I don't think. I mean, my other philosophy as a bookseller is that book sales aren't finite. So it's not like a person will only buy 5 books a year no matter what. They'll buy as many books as they want, and so it's my job to make people want books. And if I can't do that, e-readers are irrelevant to that. So. Okay.
Thank you.